When you think about digital strategy, you might picture someone orchestrating the bits of information that zip across the networks that connect computers and other technological gadgets. In fact, technology is just a small part of the story. Nam-ho Park and his fellow strategists actually spent most of their time focused on the human beings who plan, design, and use websites, apps, and other products. I really enjoyed talking with Nam-ho about his people first, technology last approach to digital experience design.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 68 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Nam-ho Park. Nam-ho is a digital strategist and a consultant in that field in Seattle, Washington. He also does a lot of other stuff, including he teaches in the I-School, the Information School at the University of Washington there. So welcome to the show, Nam-ho, and I'd love it if you could tell the folks a little bit more about yourself and what you do there in Seattle.
Yeah, sure. So there was a big spider crawling across my desk. I just need to squash it.
All right, I love that.
Okay.
Usually it's a cat on the internet, but we'll take a spider.
Yeah. Great. So there's a lot of things I do, like Larry mentioned. I think in terms of what I like doing the most, in that order, I think teaching by far is the most kind of like gratifying. I teach at the information school for the undergrads, and specifically I teach two classes. One is the capstone project class, which is the culmination of the 4-year journey that informatics students in the information school go through. And then I also teach design methods. So in terms of their major, their informatics major, I kind of bookend that experience. Design methods is one of the first classes that the majors take, and capstone is the last class that they take before they graduate, working in teams of 4 on projects that are sponsored or that they come up with by themselves. And it's really gratifying to see that full journey before they launch themselves into a career. So that's one thing that I do. Second thing that I do is I also work at an organization called Karina, which is a non-profit startup that connects Medicaid-funded clients with validated, verified, unionized home care aides, because in Washington State, people are allowed to and encouraged to age in place. So when you get old, rather than going to a nursing home, you stay at home and have a home care aide come to you. And there's funding for that through Medicaid. And so I'm the product designer there, going through user experience and design and user research and usability testing. And also, I also have my own consulting practice, as Larry mentioned, Plain Strategies, that helps clients and look at technology, and it's just me, and it's just a conversation, helping them negotiate this technology landscape to make the right decisions around technology. And having been a consultant for over 15 years around technology, I find that clients usually come to technology companies with a very clear idea of what they want to do, but without having done the due diligence around how they got there. So a lot of times they say, we want a WordPress site, without really understanding why or if that's actually the best solution. So it's to help people, clients, have a conversation around the why around what they want to do, so that they have a clear idea as to the goals that they want to achieve, and whether, and also a good perspective around what it is that they need to know in order to make that right decision.
I love that. That why is the kind of the critical core question for every strategist I've ever talked to, and focusing on that. And what you just said also, and I think most strategists would would take like a tools last approach, that you figure out what you want to do and then figure out, okay, WordPress or Drupal or Salesforce, or whatever the solution is, the technical implementation. So do you like explicitly try to back people away from, not from those decisions, but try to get them away from the tools and more into their intent about why they want to do something with technology?
Right, and this kind of comes out of my frustration, when I was working in consulting and we did technology consulting, we built platforms. And by the time they came to us, they wanted a platform, and everything, to a platform company, it's the platform, right? So every, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So we have to build them a platform rather than asking them, is this the right thing to do? And so I really wanted to kind of move upstream further, and to help clients kind of, ask the questions why. And sometimes, I find that it's not the technology, it's actually the people. So, there's the governance, there's how you work with each other. And there are a lot of things that you need to actually resolve before you even get to the technology. And once you resolve that, you might actually end up, not even needing the technology, or working with the technology you already have, or, opting to do a different type of technology.
Right. And the way, this is going to, the lingo, the language that you're using is going to be very familiar to my content strategy listeners. You're using all the same terms that we use about governance, and this observation that I've had more than one guest say, yeah, this business is, the content strategy is like about 93% people, 6% technology and 1% magic dust or something like that. And so
Yeah.
that approach, that it's mostly about people and then a governance framework to help them do what it is they want to do. And I guess so I see a lot of similarities between like what we do in the content strategy world and what you, as articulating yourself as a digital strategist. Have you thought about how to contrast and compare those two disciplines, or like those two approaches to strategy, like digital versus specifically content?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that kind of, encompass both, and there's an overlap of both. And the thing that I usually kind of tell my clients on day one is, it's never about the technology, right? It's about people, right? It's people, process, and then technology, right? And so in terms of the way that the two overlap, it's about the people, and content is about the people, the way that they want to express themselves. It happens to be through a medium, through the technology, but and there's very specific things that content strategy needs to think about in terms of how you communicate that through the various methods that you do the communication. But ultimately, it's about the people and how they want to communicate. How, is the technology the right technology to bring them the right kind of voice, the right kind of, audience, to connect them to the right kind of audience, and and how is the content delivered within that kind of context is always going to be important. And so I think there's significant overlap, and not just in the vocabulary, but in the way that we think about things between those two kind of areas.
Mm-hmm. And that, back to that, what you just said about how you approach things. When you were talking at the start, if I just cut it off at 3 minutes in, people would have just assumed that you were a UX designer, like focused on product. I mean, that's kind of how it sounded. Does that mesh with your background and approach?
Well, my original background is in architecture, right? So I have a master's in architecture, so
real
I have a lot of,
real buildings,
yeah, architecture with a capital A, right? So, what architecture kind of school taught me in terms of the foundational thing is, it's always about, in architecture, it's not about the building, really. I mean, building without the inhabitants is not a building, it's sculpture, right? And so it's the move of people through the building. It's how it accommodates gatherings, how it accommodates meeting, how it accommodates life. That's the essence, one of the key things that architecture school taught me. The other thing that architecture school taught me was, architecture is about layering of complex systems, right? Whether that be understanding the cultural context, whether that be understanding the program, whether it's understanding the site, the way that the light and the seasons change. And then you think about how the structure needs to be, how the HVAC system needs to be, the enclosure needs to be, and then you think about how the programming of the space within that needs to be, and then the interior decoration and all those things. Each of those things are complex. And how do you layer those things into a pleasurable experience that people find deep joy in inhabiting is what architecture school teaches you. And that's the same thing.
I was just going to say, the way you describe that, it sounds like the perfect background for a user experience person.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, ever since I graduated architecture school and then left architecture, I've been struggling about, what architecture taught me in terms of the way that I think about user experience and technology and what I do. And that's actually what it taught me. It's like user experience and, web design and working with users is actually is a layering of complex systems, whether that be from the database layer, how the data needs to be structured, to how it needs to be accessed, and to what is the platform, and then how is the interface configured, how is the usability configured, how is the user's needs met. That is, each layer is pretty complex, and how you kind of understand those things and layer them into a pleasurable, meaningful experience is ultimately the goal.
Right. Hey, I want to go back to, you said earlier, and you've used the term platform a couple times. And I think in some cases in the consulting world, the platform is that's like the technology solution that you're selling. That's one way that term is used. But there's also, like, the way you just used it in that prior example was more about the platform, like the front end, the view of that complex system that the user is taking of it. There's, I guess, can you unpack for me a little bit your use of the word platform and how it can maybe part of the frustration that drove you from your prior world, and how the word platform manifests now for you?
Yeah, and so I draw a lot from my architecture background, and in architecture, there's a couple of things that enable modern architecture to actually, be. One of them is standardization, right? Previously, way back when, everybody cut their own wood and made their own nails and put everything together their own way, right? Nothing was standardized, and then things started to become standardized. The 2x4 was standardized, nail sizes and screw sizes standardized, container sizes standardized. The beams, the metal kind of framing became standardized, right? And so that in a larger sense, that's the platform, right? That's the foundation upon which we enable architecture, whether that be a 100-story, skyscraper or a, small home, to be created in an efficient way. And so to me, platform, whether that be, in technology, WordPress is a platform, Drupal is a platform, and we consider these platforms. But I tend to think of it, from my kind of user experience point of view, platform is that technology that which enables us to build on top of, right? And that creates that efficiency. And so, to me, that's the way that I define a platform. And that way I become agnostic to, whether it's this platform or that platform, as we talk about in technology, rather than thinking of it in those terms. I see whether something, technology, framework, all those things kind of meet the needs and provides the flexibility and the affordance in order to achieve the purpose that we're trying to deliver in terms of the goal that the user is trying to achieve.
Right, and the way you just said, there's so much in there. Again, the architecture analogy is perfect but there's also, like you were talking, the examples you use of like the nails and the lumber and the beam thickness and whatever beam. But there's also practices that are kind of like, if not maybe not standardized, but there are sort of acknowledged and understood. If not, like, I think best practices is kind of an overused term. But there are in any one profession, there's like better ways to write JavaScript or to write HTML or CSS or to design a relational database and those kinds of things. Would you put that right alongside those sort of, and I think the analogy to the nails and the hammers would be like standards like HTTP and HTML and the W3C stuff and all that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the is as good as it serves a purpose, and I mean, all analogies aren't really tight, and there's always kind of like gaps. And when it serves a purpose of illustrating a point, like I use architecture analogy to talk about platform. It's helpful, but once you start going into the details, it tends to break down.
No, exactly.
Because
Yeah,
there are a lot of specific things to each profession that is different. One of
yeah,
the really interesting things I think is how fast this landscape is changing, right? And what we used 5 years ago or 10 years ago, isn't what we use now. There's legacy systems, but and that's the same. I think that's always a tension, in any profession, whether that be in technology, whether that be in digital strategy or content strategy. We're constantly, like slaving away to establish the principles. But at the same time, we're constantly striving to break those principles because new things come up and new innovations come up. If you take a look at architecture, right? You know, architecture has transformed over the years, right? Take a look at Seattle in the last 10 years. All the houses are boxy now, right? It's really interesting. And that has to do with the technology, that has to do with efficiency, that has to do with marketability and all of those things. So what we define as being foundational and elemental, are there to serve a purpose. But if that purpose isn't you know isn't isn't adapting to the new changes, then we have to understand enough to know when to break those.
hmm yeah. And I think what you just said, that dynamic of the ever evolving, ever changing landscape, that's really coming to a head right now. We're recording this kind of like what, about 2 months into the whole coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, and I think I think of for example, a lot of state unemployment systems are scrambling to find COBOL programmers to fix their systems to get them up to speed to handle the new stuff.
Right.
That kind of gets in. That's like kind of like having a house with like 1920s plumbing that all of a sudden you have to fix because you're having a big party or something. And
Right.
do you, I guess, as part of the platform thing you were talking about earlier, and the principles that underlie that, it seems like we're getting to an age now where like some of the platforms I think of, like big monolithic CMSs that are kind of end-to-end authoring, storage, delivery, presentation layer stuff. I think in some areas now we're seeing like a disarticulation of that in things like the Jamstack, where you have like a separate headless CMS and an intermediate layer of APIs to connect together, and then an independent front end that's stitching that back together. That seems like a general kind of principle that could help. Maybe, I don't know, again, the architecture analogy might fall apart here, but it seems like there's, in among the new practices, it seems like there's a way to built in a way to cope with this change. Is that true to you?
Yeah, I mean that's hard to kind of articulate or see in the future. Actually, let's go back in the past,
Okay.
and there was this wonderful book that I think David Weinberger wrote called "Everything Is Miscellaneous." I mean, he wrote this book. I can't remember. It's like maybe in the early 2000s, right? Where he talks about the how knowledge, previously we had the Dewey Decimal System, and everything needed to fit within the Dewey Decimal System, and sometimes it broke down, right? And he illustrates a couple of points where it breaks down when you have a monolithic kind of a classification system. And with the advent of the internet, and I think he was very, very insightfully said, everything is going to be miscellaneous, categorized as miscellaneous, except you pull it out and you group it in different ways, and that becomes incredibly dynamic, right? And so I think technology is finally catching up to that idea that everything is miscellaneous. It's out there, and it really depends on how you reap it or how you kind of package it and how you kind of distribute it, right? That becomes meaningful. Different groups will see things different ways, and different cultures will categorize things in different ways, right? And so now we're, I think, finally catching up to that idea where we have the flexibility to be able to do that without having to rely on monolithic systems.
Right. What you just said there, one of the foundations of, I think, both of our works is that notion of taxonomy. And um, I've never built a taxonomy that didn't end up with a couple of miscellaneous categories. It's frustrating. But for the most part, you can, once you're operating within a constrained domain, it's usually not too hard to sort things out. But I'm curious about that. Everything is miscellaneous. And what you said, it sounds like a more user-centered approach to this. It depends on the context of the person who's coming to look at whatever it is you have, that they're kind of building
Mhm.
their own taxonomy, and they have their own way of thinking about it. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of the technology, whether that be taxonomies, whether that be taxonomy, whether that be categorization, and various other things, have enabled us to really take advantage of what we want to see and what we're really interested in. I think it needs to be balanced because there is this serendipitous discovery that happens when you go to a library and browse the stacks, right? That you would never experience. And I think, with YouTube or Facebook and social media, you just get fed stuff that you like, or they deemed as something that they think you like, right? And so that becomes, you know, that becomes problematic, right? Because there isn't that kind of leakiness, should I say, of knowledge, right? It's not knowledge isn't tight, and it's not just defined. It's not defined by things that you think you like. It's defined by, oh, that's interesting, right? I never thought of it that way. And there's a kind of leakiness, that kind of logic, and imperfection to that logic. And I think that's something that I think as technologists we struggle with, right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of I had Sarah Walker Better on the show a couple years ago, and her book Technically Wrong. Have you read that? Where
No, I haven't.
anyhow, it's great. You'd love it, just based on what you just said.
Yeah.
But but there's many other people who've written about this as well. But that notion of that people are coming with their way of they want to look at things, and yet the digital systems that we build are come from, and classically it's like a privileged techno perspective that often misses
Hmm.
like what the user's actually looking for. I guess this kind of gets back into methods of like UX design and just digital design. Um, to what extent do you think we as a profession are recognizing those dynamics and getting better at kind of meeting the user on their own ground and giving them, actually meeting that user intent?
That's a really hard question, and honestly, I don't know. Um, because user intent is something that is really hard to understand and measure, and what people express as intent might not actually be the intent, right? So you know, there's that. I think that's like. I mean, if you can understand that, that's golden, right? I think as a UX professional, what is the intent of my user is the one most vexing question that we're constantly using all these different methods to try to understand, but never actually ultimately understanding. Because I don't think a lot of the times that users understand what intent truly is. And um, I think with algorithms, with AI, with machine learning, we're getting into a kind of an interesting territory, um, around the fact that maybe AIs understand our intent better than we do, which is really scary. They recommend things that might we might have a propensity to want even before seeing it or wanting it. So I don't know. So I tend to think that we all have free will, but in terms of the way that things are being analyzed and the way the technology is going, when we start to mine the intent of the user, it can get into very, very kind of ethically murky territory.
Yeah, I was just gonna, as you were just talking about that, I was like, oh yeah, the whole field of ethics and design ethics and in how we operate and the arrival of AI and machine learning and all these new technologies that are just gonna, well, like there's that famous, what was that bot that Microsoft released a couple of years ago that just immediately learned to be a racist, troll,
Right.
and it's like, oh crap, we're releasing a lot of like less than noble creations into the world. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah. Um, Hey, now I notice we're getting close to time. I always want to make sure before we get to the end that I give you any last chance. Is there anything that we've talked about that you that inspired additional thought, or just anything last that's on your mind that you want to make sure we share with folks before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, COVID-19, March went incredibly slow, April went incredibly fast. And, I think everybody was coming to terms with what this means, right? And, what role does technology play, right? Technology technology plays a pretty big role, albeit not the best role, right? I think you've heard of Zoom fatigue, that is real. You've heard of technologies failing huge parts of our population, the whole equity issue. Um, so, technology is never a silver bullet, right? And that's something that as a person who works with technology all the time, and something that I need to remind my students constantly, because they think they're an app, problems. How much does it solve? How much does it create new problems? How much does it prevent us from connecting in ways that we we find more valuable and fruitful, right? And so as a digital strategist, let's go back to that term, digital strategy.
Exactly. That's what I
What
was
is at the
hoping.
heart? Yeah, what is at the heart of digital strategy? It's people, and just that there's the word digital. And I'm hoping that at some point we will lose the word digital, because what's not digital these days is, we don't say digital photography, we say just photography. There's no film. You can't buy film anymore. You have to go away to buy film, right?
That's right.
And so in this world that everything has become digital, um, I have to constantly remind myself to come back to what is important, which is, human centeredness, right? And whether I'm increasing um, somebody's access, whether I'm increasing equity, whether I'm increasing, on the whole, making things better for people, rather than making things better for a small group of people, or even worse, making things worse for people, right? I have to remind my students, especially around user experience, that there are, what's called dark patterns, right, of UX, where Netflix, great example, they'll make you binge watch stuff, right, and really lose track of time, right, because they have that and next episode button right there when you finish it, and they know exactly how to get people's attention and keep people hanging on, right? And that's, in part, we recognize that there's free will, but in part we recognize that we give in to our certain desires in a certain way. And so again, what does it mean to provide meaningful, valuable um, ways of thinking about technology and strategies around providing for that is I think is at the heart of what I've learned these many years consulting around technology.
Great. Well, I love that a guy who identifies as a digital strategist is a people person and not a technophile. So thanks for being that way. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Nam-ho. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. This is great.
All right.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.